Hey everybody, welcome back to Rooked by a Crook, where I try to encourage viewers to be more skeptical in the search for life advisors. Today I want to talk through 14 warning signs that I believe are important to watch out for when you're looking for a spiritual advisor. I know, 14 is a lot, and so I've left timestamps in the description box below. You may want to skip around. Also, these 14 are not definitive, they're not exhaustive, they're just what I've come up with in my experience. And so as always, I encourage you to do your own research and develop your own healthy skepticism. Spiritual advisors can include priests or ministers. They can include gurus. They may offer us some doctrine, they may offer us some practices. Whatever you want to call them, these are what I refer to as spiritual advisors. The first three things on my list to watch out for is really involved with the integrity of the teacher. And so the first thing is, does the teacher have a lineage? Whenever a teacher is without a lineage, that means that there is no sacred text. There is no doctrine which they are following. And this can be problematic because sometimes they will pick and choose from different religions and disciplines. In the West, there are an awful lot of teachers who will popularize bits and pieces of Eastern religion, and it has no internal consistency. It's happening all around us, in our churches, in our mosques, and in our synagogues, when we fall prey to teachers and spiritual advisors that are teaching things that are not part of the doctrine and the sacred texts of our particular path. Oftentimes, this is simply chalked up to misinterpretations of doctrine, but all too often it can be misleading to the followers. What it can do is lead you down a spiritual path that leads nowhere other than the ego of the teacher. So it really is up to us to become familiar with the doctrine of the chosen path that we're on and to ensure that our teacher is following that lineage. Sometimes these teachers had a former lineage, but they left the lineage. And it's important to really question why. What isn't immediately apparent but is important in looking for a spiritual advisor with a solid lineage is that a solid lineage provides a group around the spiritual advisor. If we're talking about a minister in a particular denomination, having that denomination lineage allows for other ministers to serve that person. And finally, very importantly, it provides an oversight function. Without some kind of structure around a spiritual advisor that comes from that lineage, nobody's actually watching out to see if the teacher or minister or rabbi, imam or priest is actually doing what they say they're doing and if they're acting ethically. My second warning sign when you're seeking a spiritual advisor is, does that spiritual advisor exercise compassion and maintain professional boundaries? We all know that going to a spiritual advisor who rages at their congregation or their students is kind of suspect. But those who don't exercise compassion when someone seeks them out are equally dangerous. We often come to a teacher or a minister or a priest with a lot of shame, and we share that and unburden ourselves. If that spiritual advisor is unable or unwilling to exercise compassion, then we're left with that shame burden. And worse yet, if the spiritual advisor increases the shame that we experience, then that's a form of spiritual abuse. In terms of professional boundaries, we've all heard of these scandals in spiritual communities where there's sexual misconduct. But the road to sexual misconduct is a long one, and we should be able to spot some of the warning signs along the way. A good spiritual advisor will maintain professional boundaries and compassion at the same time. They will be there to unburden troubles of the person who is seeking their advice. But red flags should be going up anytime the seeker feels that the advisor is becoming too intimate or they're being burdened by the troubles of the advisor. Of course, every spiritual advisor is a human being and they have their own troubles, but they should never be burdening the seeker with those. That is why the community of the lineage is so important, to provide support to the spiritual advisor. A third warning sign around the integrity of a spiritual advisor is related to their charisma and charm. I'm not saying that everyone who is charismatic and charming is necessarily manipulative and suspect, but every manipulator and every cult leader out there has always been found to be charismatic and charming. The reason that this is important is that charisma and charm feeds our brain with feel-good hormones, and it breaks down our normal resistance and our normal skepticism. And so when we find that a teacher or a minister or any other kind of spiritual advisor is particularly charismatic and charming, it's wise for us to take a step back and consider that a warning sign and just go slow. The next 4 warning signs relate to manipulation techniques of the teacher. These are more prominent in some circles than others. And so the first of these, and the 4th of my warning signs, is when a spiritual advisor displays supernatural powers or miracles. In many spiritual traditions, it's common to believe that a spiritual seeker will develop spiritual powers after long periods of spiritual practice and discipline. It's also commonly believed that these spiritual powers are considered to be a distraction from the main goal of enlightenment, and they should be ignored and never displayed. They're meant to be ignored because they enforce the ego, and that prevents us from achieving oneness with the divine. In Western cultures, this is often seen in the practice of faith healing, where an individual will come and give exorbitant amounts of money in order to be healed. Money is a man-made phenomenon, and if the divine wants to heal you, I can tell you with all certainty in my heart that God does not need our money. Whether you believe that these powers are fake or real, the demonstration of supernatural powers and miracles by a spiritual advisor is suspect, and it calls into question whether perhaps they are trying to attract followers that will see them as some sort of demigod and who will give their devotion to that spiritual advisor rather than to the divine. And so in my experience, if you see a teacher, a guru, or any other kind of spiritual advisor exercising supernatural powers and performing miracles, that is a very serious red flag. A 5th red flag when seeking out a spiritual advisor is the presence of covert mind control. We all know the stories of sleep deprivation used by cults to brainwash followers. That may be a little bit harder to pull off now, but there are subtle forms of covert mind control that are actually part of our mainstream life. Aside from things like mesmerism and trickery, there is the use of hypnosis and neuro-linguistic programming by practitioners to do things like quit smoking or to conquer their fears. These are both forms of subtle mental manipulation, either through things like post-hypnotic suggestion or through pacing and anchoring. Of course, it's difficult to spot things like neuro-linguistic pacing and eye-lock induction hypnosis unless we are versed in these techniques. And so skepticism is our number 1 ally, because most of these things only work because we trust the person who is using them. Any indication that a spiritual advisor is interested in dabbling in hypnosis or neuro-linguistic programming should be cause for a little bit of caution. we can always step back and test that advisor and take our time. A great indicator that covert mind control may be at play is if you ever find yourself thinking or you hear anyone saying that people appear to be under a spell or spellbound. My sixth warning sign is something called word salad. We know that many ancient texts are arcane, and so the spiritual advisor is there to elucidate them, not to confuse us. Spiritual charlatans often talk a lot of nonsense. They might use big words or hefty sounding phrases. They might pick and choose from texts that we might be familiar with. But they always tend to talk in circles. It's easy to assume that if what's being said is going over our heads, that spiritual advisor is somehow profound. But in fact, when these words don't make sense, when they almost make sense but not quite, it creates a kind of cognitive dissonance. And this jumble of sentences that seem to say a lot but say nothing is what's called word salad. And while our minds are busy churning away, trying to piece out what was being said and try to make some sense out of it, we are distracted from things that might otherwise cause us caution. Another linguistic trick that spiritual charlatans will use is the use of a special language to describe the teachings so that they're only understandable to those who are on that particular path. Now, I'm not talking about ancient words from languages like Sanskrit or Chinese, but I'm talking about taking simple concepts and creating new words for them, so that what we end up with is a whole new language and a constructed view of the world. This unique language creates the sense of specialness and exclusivity, and it becomes its own doctrine and turns the spiritual advisor into a prophet. I don't want to challenge anybody's faith, and I don't want to seem blasphemous, but if the spiritual advisor we are seeking has this status of prophet, that alone should give us cause to pause and reflect and maybe test that teacher a little bit. It's important to note that if this language exists and only those who speak this language can understand the doctrine, then it makes it next to impossible for outsiders to criticize the faith. This seems to me to be an often overlooked red flag, but there are spiritual traditions and self-development groups all over the world who are currently using these kinds of constructed languages. The remaining warning signs all relate to dubious practices of the group, and we'll cover those in part 2 next time.